the Sartans and the Patrins. Let's talk about the Death Gate cycle. G'day to all you lovely people and welcome back to my channel. I'm Kathy and today I want to talk about this, the Death Gate cycle. This is book 1, Dragon Wing. There are 7 books altogether and they were written by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. Okay, I'm not going to hold it up because it gets heavy after a while. Now, I'd like to talk about some spoilers, so I'm going to split this review into 3 parts. Without spoilers, with spoilers, and a summary and score for the series at the end. And timestamps will be in my description box below. Okay. Now, Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman have collaborated on many books, but in my opinion, the Death Gate cycle is their best. It is one of my all-time favourites, even to this day. In fact, I only recently reread it. After a gap of probably 15 years, I was curious to see how I would find it after all this time. And I still love it. Yeah, I really do. However, I will say that in some respects it does feel a little bit dated. But that does not take away my enjoyment of this series, of the great story and many of the characters. The first book in the series, Dragon Wing, came out in 1990, so it is over 30 years old. And in my opinion, the fantasy that was written back then is quite different to the fantasy you see today. It is more classic or high fantasy. In fact, in this series, there are also elves and dwarves, as well as humans. And I also think that back in the 90s, 80s and 90s, most of the fantasy that was being written wasn't as grim or unrelentingly grim as some of the fantasy today. But I will say, it's not that this series is all sweetness and light and nothing grim happens. Certain horrible things do occur in this series. It's just quite different from fantasy today. Now I wanted to talk about what the Death Gate cycle is all about, what the series is about. In essence, there are several races in this universe that the authors have created. There are elves and dwarves and humans, and then there are also 2 other races. They are called the Sartans and the Patrins, who are enemies, basically. The Sartans and Patrins are, though, much more powerful magically than the other 3 races. They are almost like demigods, I guess. Because these 2 superior races are in conflict, the Sartans, as a result, basically sundered their world, which I believe is meant to represent Earth, and split it into 4 different realms: Earth, air, fire, and water. There is also a labyrinth which the Sartans created for the Patrins to teach them a salutary lesson. Instead, this labyrinth became a prison where the Patrins had to fight for their lives just to survive, let alone escape this labyrinth. There are also several other worlds which we discover as we progress through the series. The Death Gate itself is a portal through which you travel to any of these other worlds. The overall plot, I think, in relation to this series involves this conflict between the Sartans and the Patrins. Naturally, since the Patrins had been imprisoned in the labyrinth for hundreds of years, they have an abiding hatred for the Sartans and would like to revenge themselves on them. However, in the first 4 books, we are not so much concerned about this overall plot, rather the conflicts that are facing the different inhabitants on each of these worlds. Eventually, they do all tie in together, however. One of my favourite things about these 2 authors is that they are so good at character development, in my opinion anyway. I think they're very, very good at redeeming almost irredeemable characters who you would never dream you could like, and yet we get to understand them so well throughout the series that you come to an appreciation of why this character behaves a certain way. I also think that the Deathgate Cycle has one of the best character story arcs that I have ever read regarding the character Haplo, who is our main character. And each of these books has a prologue, I believe that's right, where Haplo is writing a letter to his Lord Tsar, the head of the Patricians. And when we start the series, we learn that Haplo, who is a main character, has escaped the labyrinth with the help of his Lord Tsar. And Haplo's mission, on instructions from Tsar, is to visit each of these 4 elemental worlds, observe what is going on these worlds, create as much chaos or conflict as he can, and see if he can find where the Sartans are. As I've said, there are 7 books in this series, but the first 4 we spend in each of these 4 elemental worlds. When we start the series, Dragonwing, the first book, basically takes place on Arianis, a sky world, which I just love this whole idea that races are living in the clouds actually. In Dragonwing, we meet several of the major characters we see throughout this series. Characters like Hugh the Hand, the assassin, who I loved, and Limbeck, the most adorable dwarf ever, I think, a naive, idealistic young dwarf who questions everything. We also meet Alfred. I love Alfred. Yeah, I love a lot of the characters, as well as Bane, the human child. Whilst Haplo seems to be our main character, or so we think at the beginning of this series, he is a secondary character, I think, at least in several of these first 4 books. In Dragonwing, the real story involves the different races and the issues that they are facing. And a lot of the conflict involves the supply of water. And the Quincy Wincy, this great machine that no one really knows much about, is actually maintained by the dwarves to provide water to the elves. But this also causes conflict with the humans. That is the basic plot of Dragonwing. Elvenstein is the second book. And in this world, the 3 different races are facing creatures who are destroying their world, the Titans. I'll confess this one was the one I liked the least out of the entire series. In fact, I have a lot of issues with this book, and it was hard to get through. But it did introduce us to the world of, I think it is meant to be Earth, I guess, because it is predominantly a forest world. If I had read this first, if this was the first book in the series, I would not have continued with it. I found this one such a big disappointment. I did not like any of the characters, yet none of the elves or dwarves or humans. In fact, they were all just so dull and boring and shallow and superficial. And the romances, oh my God, yeah, I don't think the authors are very good at romances, because the ones in this drove me nuts. It did not seem like a fantasy, but rather a souped up romance. Romances, I should say. And the Titans, they were so dull. Honestly, I think I needed a little bit more to make them feel scary, threatening. It could have been done so much better. I don't think it was executed very well. And if I hadn't known how good this series gets after this book, I probably would have given up. The third book, Fire Sea, is a world underground with caverns and a sea of fire, lava actually. This one is quite different to the first 2. Fire Sea, I think, is a real step up from Alvin Star. I actually think it's probably even better than Dragonwind, which is one of my favourites in this series. But the world that the authors created was fascinating, as well as the inhabitants, and that is all I'm going to say. The fourth book is Serpent Mage, which takes place in a water world. Again, there is a conflict in this one, and we are also introduced to a new creature, the serpents, and that is all I really want to say without touching on spoilers. Once we finish with the first 4 books, now that all of these elements are in play, the rest of the books, the next 3, are predominantly about the conflict between the Sartans and the Patrins. The 5th book is Hand of Chaos. In this one, we actually do go back to Arianus. We see Limbeck again, we see Bane again, as well as Haplo and Alfred. Yes, the 6th book is Into the Labyrinth itself. And if you've read this series, I'm sure you are as keen as me to see the labyrinth itself, because you hear so much about it throughout the rest of the books. And the final book is The 7th Gate. I'm not going to say anything else about it except that I was very happy with the way the series concluded. So that is the 7 books in the series. I'm not going to go into detail about the plots in each of these books. I think I've already explained what the overall story is. Initially, when we start this series, because we are viewing the world through Haplo's eyes, we are given to believe that the Sartans are monsters. They sundered the world into these 4 different elements and caused a lot of deaths as a result. They also imprisoned the Patrins in the labyrinth, where they had to fight for their lives and their actual existence. And it is through sheer determination and strength of will, I think, that they actually survived and were able to escape the labyrinth. So I think we are meant to dislike the Sartans, but because Haplo's mission is to create chaos on these 4 different worlds, to mess with the lives of the Mensch, as they call them, I immediately found myself disliking Haplo. In fact, at least in the first couple of books, if not 3 of them, he's very cold, ruthless, calculating, and actually quite callous. He cares nothing about any of these races, nor does he care how much destruction or pain he is going to cause these people who he has gotten to know. So he's not a very likable character, and I think as a result, I don't trust his word on the Sartans. I wanted to learn more about them independently of Haplo, or independently of the Patrins. And as we go through book 1 in particular, Dragonwing, it seems that perhaps the Sartans aren't as evil as they are being portrayed by Haplo. It seems they may be actually more benevolent, kinder than the Patrins are. And yet, when we do actually meet the Sartans later on in the series, it became very clear to me that the Sartans and Patrins were as bad as each other. They were both driven by ambition and arrogance and smugness, which was also their downfall, I guess, who believed that because they had higher magical abilities, that the Mensch, the humans, dwarves and elves, had to be ruled by them. Ultimately, I decided that they were as bad as each other and that the Mensch would be better off without them. I like it, however, when we have a character like Haplo, who we see throughout the series more than anyone else, who I do dislike, and yet the author succeeded in making me understand him, why he was the way he was. Obviously, anyone growing up in the labyrinth, I think, would be a real mess, but He had good reasons for his hatred, for example, of the Sartans. But what I love the most, I think, about this character Haplo is how he develops through this series. In fact, I think it was in Fire Sea, you start seeing some cracks in Haplo, or his certainty regarding the instructions he has been given by Tsar. But it was really, I think, in Serpent Mage, Book 4, in the water world, that I really started to like Haplo, because I could see him changing, growing. He became, I guess, more human, right? More understanding, compassionate, caring. He actually did care about several of the characters here, several of the mensch, as they call them, which I really don't like this term because it is derogatory, but it's easier than having to say humans, dwarves and elves all the time. Regardless, it was in this book that Haplo became somebody I started to admire. Haplo is not the only character who grows and develops so much throughout this series. So does Alfred. His character shows immense growth throughout the series. When we first meet Alfred, he is this bumbling, cowardly character who trips over his own feet, and yet there is so much more to this character than you realize. Other characters who grow, I think, include Hugh the Hand, the assassin, and Limbeck. Limbeck, I think, transforms himself into something that you cannot help but admire. That is one of my favourite parts of the Deathgate cycle, is seeing these amazing characters growing, changing, evolving throughout the books. And then, of course, is this great concept of these different worlds. I just loved having an air world, for example, and a water world, and even the fire world. The only one I didn't like, and I put that down to not liking the book itself, was Alvenstar. Now, perhaps I'm wrong, but I don't remember reading anything similar like this. Not now and not before. It seemed very original to me, and that's what I loved about it. Even though I generally don't like stories with elves and dwarves. Yeah, I'll admit it. Sorry, but I don't. Yeah, I might like classic fantasy, but not that classic. Regardless, it was the whole dynamic between the different races, the Patrins, the Sartans, and the other races that make this series so compelling. And I do feel that they had so many great messages throughout this series about trying to live in harmony with different groups, including things like learning tolerance and acceptance and understanding each other, even celebrating our differences rather than using them to beat each other over the head with. I think there is also this other theme of self-determination. Here we have two very powerful races, the Sartans and the Patrins, both of which feel that the mensch need them to guide them, to rule them. Why? Because they are considered inferior? If anything, I think the series shows that these other races are just as capable as the Sartans and Patrins. They don't need that kind of magic to live in harmony. I loved this manifestation of evil in the form of these serpents. And what I particularly loved was that this isn't something that exists isolated from us. It comes from within all of us. Something else I really loved was the realization that both Haplo and Alfred came to, that the real enemy was not each other, but the serpents, and that in order to defeat these serpents, they needed to work together. Now, there were a few things I didn't like. I found the character Sinistrad, Bane's father, who we met in Dragonwing. His storyline could have been so interesting, but honestly, it fell so flat. It seemed actually quite anticlimactic. I think if he had played a larger part in the first book or even in future books, that might have been a great storyline. The character Bane, wow, I hated this child so much. But my issue is not the character himself, who I just despised. I just did not find it believable that he could be that mature at the age of 10. It didn't ring true to me at all. Now, you might argue he's supposed to be a genius. I don't agree. No child is that mature at such a young age. If the authors had made him a little bit older, I would have been able to accept this character more. But I just kept thinking, oh, come on, no child would do this. Perhaps I'm wrong, but that was just my feeling throughout the books. And I just despised him so much that when I saw him again in The Hand of Chaos, I was quite disappointed. I thought, oh, I don't want to deal with this character anymore. Hugh the Hand, however, what a wonderful character. I think I would have enjoyed a series just on Hugh. He was such a contradiction. Here we have this assassin who actually does have some softer feelings and who has been shaped so much by his childhood. I really enjoyed his character, and I enjoyed seeing him change actually throughout the series. Something though that I didn't like was the elves' souls being in these like butterflies. Honestly, to me, that whole storyline with the butterflies, as I'll call them, seemed superfluous. I just felt it was a cool idea. I just don't think it was fleshed out enough. Perhaps then I would have enjoyed it more. My battery died just as I was finishing up. Okay. There's also a character introduced in the series later on, actually, a love interest. I found this whole storyline lacked resonance. I thought she was in fact the most underdeveloped character in this series, and I did not like her all that much. I'm curious if you've read the series whether you have a similar view, but her change in attitude was not realistic. I don't think so anyway. There was also this city in the labyrinth, which I found hard to accept considering what we were told about the labyrinth. I was a little disappointed actually. I felt we didn't spend enough time on the labyrinth. We spent more time in this city, and that wasn't what I wanted to see. I wanted to learn about the actual labyrinth. I wanted to see it in action. However, I did like the leader of this city, Vasu, I think his name is. He epitomized for me the best in both the Sartans and the Patrins. And I just loved so much the relationship between Alfred and Haplo. I just loved how it developed throughout the series, how it changed, transformed as they got to know each other better, understand each other better. And let me conclude by saying that I was very satisfied with the way this series ended. I thought it was fitting. It was how I would have wanted the series to end. It seemed appropriate, actually, that the Sartans and Patrins have to learn to live together. After everything we have learned about them, to see them having to cohabitate together was just perfect. Especially given that the other races will be left to live their own lives without interference. One of the best things I liked about the way the series ended was, in the end, it was clear that these other three races didn't need the Sartans or the Patrins, that they could get along quite well on their own. And they did not need these so-called superior beings to rule their lives for them. I loved that actually. It was, I think, the perfect ending. So let's summarize. Whilst this series may be 30 years old and may even feel a little dated if you're more used to the fantasy today, I still think it has so much to offer. It isn't your traditional high fantasy with dwarves, elves, and humans. There are also these other two species. There are also so many great themes about tolerance and understanding and acceptance. And I loved how they represented evil throughout this series. Let alone the worlds. Yeah, just having all these different worlds was such a unique idea, I think, at the time. And I think they did a brilliant job at being able to describe these distinctive worlds in these books. I highly recommend the Deathgate Cycle. I think I have read quite a bit of fantasy over the years, and this still remains one of my favourites. As for a score, I've thought about this. I'm going to give the Deathgate Cycle 7.5 out of 10. If I had liked Elvenstar more, it might have gotten a higher score. Well, that is all I have for you guys today, but I would love to hear if you have ever heard of the Deathgate Cycle. Have you read it? I would love to hear your opinions on it, and you can put it down in the comments or you can contact me on Instagram. Thank you all so very much for hanging out with me. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then you can do the usual. You can like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I hope you all have a beautiful day, and I will see you next time. Bye! In this series, there are also dwarves and dwarves. In fact, in this series, there are also dwarves.